Good afternoon, and welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation's Meet the Scientist monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, BBRF's President and CEO. Today, Dr. Kristin Javaras will present Is Stressed Really Desserts Spelled Backwards? How more objective assessment of eating behavior can refine our understanding of stress eating. BBRF is the world's largest private funder of mental health research grants, supporting transformative discoveries in order to develop improved treatments, cures, and methods of prevention. The high quality of the research we fund is made possible by the BBRF Scientific Council. This group of 195 prominent mental health researchers reviews each grant application and selects the most promising ideas with the greatest potential to lead to breakthroughs. The Scientific Council guides the Foundation to fund creative and impactful basic, translational, and clinical research relevant to the whole spectrum of mental health. One reason that research funded by BBRF has such great impact is because we do not limit ourselves to one illness or condition. Since 1987, the Foundation has awarded over $462 million to fund more than 6,500 research grants around the world and across a broad spectrum of brain conditions, including addiction, ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, eating disorders, OCD, post-traumatic stress, schizophrenia, as well as suicide prevention. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Kristin Javaras. Dr. Javaras is assistant psychologist in the Division of Women's Health at McLean Hospital and assistant professor of psychology in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. She was a 2023 BBRF Young Investigator. Our webinar will begin with Dr. Javaras' presentation, which will then be followed by Q&A. To submit your questions, please use the question tab on the control panel on your screen. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time. Following the presentation, I'll ask as many questions as possible in the time allotted. And now, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Javaras. Kristin, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. I want to begin by acknowledging my disclosures, and in particular, I want to express my gratitude to the many organizations that have funded the research my laboratory has done on how stress and negative emotion impact eating. And that includes the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation. I also want to point out from the very beginning that the work my laboratory has done represents the considerable efforts and important contributions of many people listed here, because research takes a village. So I'm going to start with the big picture and then get a little bit more granular. I don't think I need to tell anyone in the audience today that Americans are currently very stressed. So back in 2023, the Stress in America report found that almost 1/4 of Americans reported an average stress over the past month that was extreme. So 8, 9, or 10 out of 10. And when people were asked what were their top types of stress, health and finance topped the list. In terms of the relationship between stress and health, it's complicated, and you can read more about that in this excellent review, which came out in 2021 by O'Connor and colleagues. And one finding is that stress impacts health partly through behavior. So stress can change behaviors, which then in turn can impact health. But there's another pathway between stress and health that doesn't go through these behaviors, And it might represent biological changes in the body that are due to stress that aren't manifesting in behavior. And so what are these behaviors? Well, they're numerous, but the ones that researchers and clinicians tend to focus on are use of tobacco, alcohol, and other drugs, sleep, physical activity, and eating. And today I'm going to be focusing on eating. So beginning with that topic, I'm going to give you a brief overview of what I tend to call stress-related eating. But first, I am a statistician as well as a clinical psychologist, so please permit me a brief statistical digression that pertains to this topic. So many of you probably know that a lot of research methods and findings focus on the average, often the mean. And that could be a situation like this, where the average does capture sort of the most common values of the thing you're looking at. But there are other situations, and stress-related eating is one of them, where the average may not be that informative because there are two or more different phenomena going on. And so that's this situation where some of the people are here below zero, some of the people are up above zero, and the average is sort of between them and doesn't capture either of the people below or above zero very well. And I want you to keep that in mind throughout the talk, and I'm going to be referring to the average a lot. So going back to how stress impacts eating, which is my focus today, I'm sure you've all seen these strong messages that stress is associated with eating more, especially more comfort food, as depicted here with stressed is dessert spelled backwards. And since this became one of the focuses or foci of my research, I've noticed how often in TV shows and movies, stress and character is stressed and a friend will come over with Ben & Jerry's. It's just a sort of ubiquitous message. And when we look at how stress impacts eating, one way it can impact eating is by affecting the amount you eat. So eating more would be referred to as food intake. It can also affect what you choose to eat. And that's often referred to in research as food choice. So eating more comfort food would be food choice. And I'm currently doing a study that examines how stress impacts food choice that's funded by the BBRF, as well as the National Institute of Health. But today I'm actually going to be focusing on this first thing, so eating more. You'll have to tune in later to hear more about food choice. And when I refer to stress-related eating in this talk, I'm primarily going to be referring to people's overall food intake and how it changes with stress. If I'm also referring to food choice, I'll make a note of that. So how does stress impact food intake? Well, you can see that a little over a third of people say that they eat less when they're stressed. A slightly larger number, more like 40%, say that they eat more when they're stressed. And then about 20% say, it doesn't really, my eating doesn't change. And of course, these numbers do vary a bit from study to study or sample to sample. And these are averages that I've calculated based on the first 3 studies listed below. And one thing that's important to note, which comes from the Stress in America report from 2014, which focused on how stress affects certain behaviors. What people who reported eating less when they're stressed said was that it was due primarily to lower appetite. They weren't as hungry when they were stressed. So now, if you're looking at this picture and you're thinking about averages, what you can see is that the average would probably fall somewhere around here. And that doesn't really very well capture the people who eat less or the people who eat more. And that makes this topic particularly tricky to study. So this is a study that is nationally representative, and it looked at the association between stress-related eating, in particular, having greater food intake and eating more comfort food when stressed. It looked at how that is related to metabolic health. And what they found was that reporting increased food intake or more comfort food choice when stressed was associated with an increased odds of prediabetes and diabetes, and also higher levels of glucose, insulin resistance, and HbA1c among those without diabetes. So this suggests that there may be an association between eating more when you're stressed or eating more comfort food and certain adverse metabolic outcomes. And so then that begs the question of how do we change this tendency, or how do we change stress-related eating? And so there have been a number of smaller pilot studies that have looked at mindfulness meditation in different forms as an intervention for stress-related eating, in particular, eating more, having higher food intake when stressed. A lot of the earlier studies were small, as is common for pilot studies, and did not include a control condition that some people were randomized to. But this recent study, which came out about a year ago, it did include a control condition focused on health that some people were randomized to, and it allowed them to compare mindfulness to the health condition. And what they found was that the mindfulness meditation intervention was associated with a small decrease in stress-related food intake. And I'm going to walk you through the results now. So stress-related eating was measured with the Salzburg Stress Eating Scale, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about later. High scores, so over here, represent people who say they eat more when they're stressed. And low scores over here represent people who say they eat less when they're stressed. And these graphs show the distribution of scores. So the higher they are, the more people have that score. The light green color is before the intervention. The darker green is after the intervention. And what you can see is that for the experimental group that did mindfulness, their scores on the stress eating scale, they moved lower after the intervention. So the mean was about here, and then it moved to about here after the intervention. So in other words, stress-related eating decreased. In the control group, you can see, so that's the group that did the control health condition. And what you can see is the scores didn't really change. The two distributions for before and after are very strongly overlapping. And so this is sort of the end of the overview. And at the beginning, I told you it was stress-related in eating, an overview. But now what I'm going to tell you is that I actually should have titled it Stress-Related Eating, an overview based on self-report. And I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so talking about what self-report means and how it compares to other methods. And we're really going to get down in the weeds, because if you're a researcher, you have to love the weeds as well as the big picture. But at the end, we'll come back up to the big picture. And so the first thing to point out is what we're trying to measure, we often call the ground truth. And the ground truth would be, say, if I could follow you around throughout your life, and I would know, when you're stressed or experiencing a stressor, and I would also be able to measure and record all your food intake accurately. And then I could figure out, how does your stress, how does it correlate with your food intake? And I could also sort of try and control out a lot of other things that are changing along with stress. And so that would be, in some ways, the ground truth. But of course, that's not really possible. It would be very annoying if I followed you around all the time. So we tend to use 3 different approaches. And I'm going to focus first on self-report questionnaires, right here in the middle in red. And so these are this approach is really just what it sounds like. So you answer 1 or more questions. For instance, an example might be, when you experience a stressful event, do you eat more or do you eat less? And your response would be, yes or no, or a sliding scale would be a reflection of stress-related eating. So turning to the laboratory tasks, this approach to measurement involves coming into the laboratory and doing either something stressful or something not stressful, and then consuming food afterwards. And then the researcher can see, is your food intake different after the stressful condition? And lastly, cell phone surveys. This approach used to be implemented via paper diaries, but now it's mostly done via cell phone. That would involve essentially carrying around your cell phone and either one or more times a day getting a little ping and going in and filling out a survey where you rate how stressed you are, if you've had any stressors, and also report what you've eaten recently or how much you've eaten recently. And then researchers can look at the correlation between your stress and what you eat. And I would say ideally, self-report questionnaires would be a great measure of the ground truth because they're much less labor intensive for the person doing them and for the researcher. And in an ideal world, all three of these approaches would reflect the ground truth. And so the question is, since we can't really know the ground truth, which of these approaches is actually capturing the ground truth? And we can really sort of infer that since we can't directly observe the ground truth. So I'm next going to take a little bit of a detour. And I'm going to talk about, first, I'm going to talk about some examples of the self-report questionnaires for stress-related eating before getting back to comparing these different methods. So in general, in sort of more historically, this research really used very straightforward, simple questions, one or two that asked something like, when you're stressed, do you eat more or less? And many of them just focused on more and didn't necessarily ask about less. And more recently, in 2018, Mule and colleagues published the Salzburg Stress Eating Scale. And this includes a number of different questions that ask about how your eating changes more or less in response to different ways of describing stress. You would sort of sum up your different responses, and that sum would represent your tendency to eat more versus less when you're stressed. And so now I'm going to really take a detour and talk about emotion-related eating, and you'll understand why in a moment. And so it's important to note that emotion-related eating is a similar concept to stress-related eating, but not identical, because you can think of negative emotions like sadness that are really not the same as stress. So they're similar, but not identical. And there's been a lot more research done on emotion-related eating than stress-related eating. And that's partly why I'm going to talk about it, because there are a lot of findings I can tell you about. And one thing to know is that one of the earliest questionnaires in this area that assessed people's emotion-related eating was the Dutch Eating Behavior Questionnaire. And you can see some examples of questions there. And that was published back in the 80s. And a lot of the research on emotion-related eating utilizes that questionnaire. But in the late aughts, there started to appear sort of a number of different studies saying, well, actually, people's responses to this questionnaire, they really don't seem to map on to how their eating changes when they're experiencing negative emotion in the laboratory. And so when I portray studies, the ones that tilt to the left are going to say, okay, the laboratory or other more objective findings really don't map on very well to the questionnaires. The ones that lean to the right are going to be studies that support the idea that there's at least some relationship, there's some correlation between people's report on these questionnaires and the more objective measures, like in the laboratory. So the first report that I'm aware of came out in 2009. So it sort of was not supporting an association between the questionnaires and the laboratory measures. And then there was another one going the other way, and then a commentary, another one not supporting, and another one supporting. So at that point, I was doing my own study. The goal was not to assess, how good is self-report. There was another goal, but I was able to look at how well the self-report measures correlated with people's behavior in the laboratory. And one thing I'd thought about in reading these earlier papers was, well, maybe it's that in the laboratory that, there's not an infinite number of foods to choose from. There may be just one. And, people, when they eat emotionally, they have foods that they tend to go to. Not everyone likes the same food. I mean, for those of us who love chocolate, it's sort of unimaginable that someone might not love it, but that's true. Some people really don't like chocolate. So maybe I was thinking, well, maybe it's, partly that people don't have the foods they really like to eat. So when I did my study, I made sure that we focused on people who did like the foods we were offering, which was chocolate milkshake. And this study was published in 2022. And it was a pilot study of a novel task. And we included 20 young adult women. And it's important to note that 40% of them had a current or past eating disorder, specifically bulimia nervosa or binge eating disorder. And I'm pointing that out partly because a lot of the research I'm going to highlight today does not include individuals with eating disorders. Although I'm very happy in the Q&A session at the end to circle back and talk more about eating disorders. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But this study did include some women with eating disorders. And so in the study, people did a task, and the task included 12 different trials. And each trial had 3 phases. I'm going to walk you through each of those phases. So in the cyberball phase, the participant played a throwing game on the computer, represented here, and the other players, who were unbeknownst to the participant, actually the computer, in some trials, they included the participant in the throwing game about equally, and in other trials, they mostly excluded the participant and didn't throw the ball to them. And what's been shown is that cyberball does tend to increase people's sense of rejection and their negative emotion, pretty reliable. So when you're excluded, you tend to feel worse than when you're included. And so after playing 25 seconds of cyberball, people viewed an image of chocolate, and then they were given 7 seconds to drink chocolate milkshake as much as they wanted. And unbeknownst to the participants, we were actually able to measure how much people were drinking. And we could compare how much they drank when they were having milkshake right after being included in cyberball versus on a trial where they'd just been excluded. And it's also important to note that most people were not aware we were measuring their milkshake intake. I think only 1 out of the 20 suspected that we might be. Because of course, if you're aware something's being measured, it can change your behavior. So people did this 12 different times. Half of the times they were included in the cyberball game, half of the times they were mostly excluded. And this is a picture of the results from our models. And what we found was that, not surprisingly, as people got to the later trials, they drank less chocolate milkshake. And that makes sense because you tend to become more full. You also tend to become satiated with respect to that particular food. And on average, there was really no difference in how much people drank after they'd just been excluded versus after they'd just been included. If anything, it's a little bit less after exclusion in red than it is after inclusion in blue, but that difference isn't really significant. But of course, I knew, some people go one way, some people go the other way when upset. So it's not surprising that on average, there's really no difference. And I asked, well, if we take people's self-report of emotion-related eating based on the Dutch Eating Behavior Questionnaire, could that predict what happens for them. And so over here are the people who reported on that self-report measure that they tend to really eat more when they're distressed. And what you would expect is that you would expect that the red dots, the red line, which is exclusion, those would be higher. They would have more milkshake after being excluded, and it would be above the green line, which is the milkshake when they're included. But that's really not what you see. And in fact, there was really no relationship between people's report of whether they eat more when they're distressed and what they actually did in the study. And so at that point, I thought, well, it's a small pilot study, and we don't really have any people with very high emotion-related eating scores. So the jury is still out. But then this is what happened afterwards. So there were a number of other studies that came along looking at the relationship between what, essentially the self-report questionnaires and how they mapped onto either the laboratory measures or the cell phone survey measures. And remember, left is they don't map on very well, right is they do map on. And so this is what happened after 2011. So as you can see, most of the studies are leaning left. And so it makes you wonder, is this a cautionary tale that might also pertain to stress-related eating? Because we're in this scenario with emotion-related eating where here are the self-report questions, and they're not really overlapping with the laboratory measures or the cell phone surveys. And you start to wonder, are we in a scenario where none of these are necessarily capturing the ground truth, where maybe it's the laboratory measures are capturing the ground truth? Maybe it's the questionnaires are capturing the ground truth, or maybe the cell phone surveys. Or as I mentioned previously, maybe none of them, which would be a worst case scenario, or maybe all of them are picking up different aspects of the ground truth. And it's hard to know based just on these data. So we're going to return now to stress-related eating. And there have been fewer studies, as I mentioned earlier, but in the past few years, there have been a couple. This was a laboratory study that found that the Salzburg stress eating scale did not predict people's eating after a stressful experience in the laboratory. And this was a cell phone study, and here the findings were a bit mixed, but I'd say people's self-report of stress eating, it did not predict their immediate response to higher stress in this study. So less evidence than there is for emotion-related eating, but in general, there's not strong support suggesting that the self-report measures map onto the other types of measures. And so we're in this scenario where, again, the self-report doesn't overlap with the lab measures, maybe a little closer to the cell phone measures. And of course, we want to know, which of these best reflects the ground truth. And so lest you become concerned at this point that this is a phenomenon, this discrepancy between self-report and behavior is something that is specific to the area of stress and emotion-related eating, I just want to point out that it's actually a ubiquitous phenomenon. So this is a paper from a different area of behavior that talks about how, in general, self-report is weakly correlated with behavioral measures. And it goes into some potential explanations for why that may be the case. And that's what I'm going to do now. So we're going to talk about how each of these approaches might differ, and I'm going to first focus on how they study stress. So in the laboratory approach, you come into the lab and you do something that the investigator has selected or the researcher has selected that is meant to be stressful. It's a single, typically acute stressor, and it was chosen by the investigator, and they can measure whether you subjectively experience it as stressful based on your reports after the stressor. They can also collect biological measures of stress like cortisol. So with the questionnaires here in pink, the stress and stressors are really naturally occurring in people's daily lives. We don't know what types they are because the questionnaires don't specify. And importantly, they're subjectively selected. And what that means is you have to realize that you're stressed to report on that stressor or stressful experience. And that's really an important point because a lot of research has shown that people can be stressed biologically or show biological signs of stress when they don't actually report or seem to experience any stress. And the sort of biological markers of stress and the subjective experience of stress are more closely tied for some people, but they're really not very closely tied for others. And so, stress could impact your eating, even if you're not aware you're stressed. And then for the cell phone approach, essentially, it's more similar to the questionnaire approach on the whole. So next, how do you measure food intake in these different approaches? Well, in the laboratory, it's measured, by definition in the laboratory, it's usually immediately after, and it's the foods presented, it's the amount you consume of the foods presented in the laboratory, and it's objectively assessed. So the researchers typically measure how much is eaten. In contrast, in both the questionnaire and the cell phone approach, the food intake occurs in the natural world. You're choosing what to eat, how much, and you're eating however much you want of that. And you're also subjectively assessing what and how much you eat. And with the timing, it's sort of unclear with questionnaires. Are people reporting on they're eating during the stress, after the stress, long after, delayed amount after the stress? And so, as you can see, there's some real differences in these approaches. And I'm really going to focus now on why the fact that food intake is subjectively assessed in the questionnaire and cell phone methods might be a problem. And I'm going to talk about this study, which was done back in 2010 and included young women. And it had them do something, some of them do something that was low stress, something that was high stress, and then it gave them food, for example, M&Ms to eat afterwards. And what they found was that people's self-report of their emotional eating, it didn't predict actually eating more in the stress condition. So it didn't predict actual food intake, but what it did predict was overestimating one's food intake. And I'm going to walk you through that here. So here is low stress, here is high stress, and here are the people who say that they're very high on emotional eating. They tend to eat more when they're stressed. And over here, it's the difference between how much they thought they ate and how much they actually ate. So up here is an overestimate. You think you ate more than you actually did. And down here is an underestimate. So you think you ate less than you actually did. And what you can see is for that high emotional eating group, who they perceive that they eat more when they're stressed, they're underestimating their food intake when they're not in the non-stress condition or the low stress condition, but they're overestimating it in the high stress condition. And it goes the other way for people who are low, who don't describe themselves as emotional eaters. And what that tells you is that potentially, even if people's food intake doesn't actually change when they're upset or stressed, they could think it's changed because they perceive it differently. And that could be a real problem for the self-report based methods. So going back to this table, so we've talked about how the stress and emotion occur and are measured, the same for the food intake, but now how do we look at how they go together? Well, in the laboratory study, the investigator, and this is also true in the cell phone method, the investigator looks at, when there's the stressful condition, how does the food intake change? They calculate it. Whereas for the questionnaires, people are really sort of subjectively assessing this. And the reason that this might be a problem and might introduce some error in their assessments is that we basically, we want someone to sort of say, across all the stressful experiences, on average, how does your eating change? And that's not really how memory works for any of us. Certain things might stand out for us. And in particular, the times when you ate more might stand out more than the times when you ate less when you were stressed. And so you then might be able to get different answers to the questions depending on how you ask them. And so we're going to do a little experiment of our own. And so I'm going to first ask you, do you eat more when you're stressed? So take a second and think about it and come up with a yes or no or maybe answer. Okay, so we're going to try another approach so you can, try to remember your first answer. And now I'm going to ask you to think of a time you were stressed in the past 2 weeks. I'll give you a minute to search your memory. And at that recent time when you were stressed, did you eat more? So probably, and hopefully what some of you found is that you didn't give the same answer to the first and second question. And so there were investigators or researchers who looked at this back in 2009, and in a sample of 89 undergraduates, they compared the two approaches. And what they found was that the percent of people who said they ate more was higher when you asked sort of in general, probably because they could think of a time they'd eaten more when stressed. But when you asked about a recent stressor, that number went down by 10%. And so that tells you that people's perception of the association really depends on what they're choosing to remember. So last but not least, when you look at the association in a laboratory study, you can generally, under certain conditions, infer that the stressor is causing the change in food intake, provided you have adequately controlled other things that might differ between the stressful and non-stressful condition. Whereas in the other two approaches, it's really correlational. And you might have, you've undoubtedly heard the expression, correlation does not imply causation. This is one of my favorite cartoons. I'll give you a second to read it. And, the sort of well-known example of this is that ice cream consumption and sunburn tend to be correlated. As one goes up, the other tends to go up. But of course, thankfully, it doesn't seem that ice cream consumption causes sunburn. It's really a third variable, temperature, that increases and drives the increase in both of those. And so just because two things are correlated doesn't mean that one is causing the other. So just because your food intake is going up or down when you're stressed, there could be something else going on that's changing alongside your stress that's actually causing the change in food intake. And so now you're probably wondering, well, which of these approaches is the best? And I think it really depends on what what aspect of things you tend to think is most important. So I think there are a lot of people who do laboratory experiments typically who would say, objective assessment is really important, and being able to infer causation, because some of these subjective aspects can really introduce a lot of error and bias. And so they would, tend to fall in the camp of feeling that probably the laboratory measures reflect the ground truth. There's another group of people who would probably say, actually, we prefer the naturally occurring emotions and food intake because, when you do something stressful in the laboratory, like giving a speech for a sort of fake job interview, it's just not the same as doing a job interview in the real world. And also, people just aren't going to exhibit stress eating in the laboratory. It's too artificial. And so these people would probably prefer, the questionnaire or cell phone measures. And so for today, though, I'm going to focus the next section of my talk on the laboratory measures. And this findings from a recent review. And what they found was that acute stressors cause an extremely small increase in food intake, overall food intake, on average, among adults without pre-existing medical conditions. But to go back to what I said earlier, that's on average, and we know people go both ways. So really, how do we understand what predicts whether someone experiences a decrease or an increase? Well, there's not really enough studies that allow you to look at whether people's self-report of their stress eating affects whether they eat more or less when they're stressed in the laboratory. But there are a lot of studies that look at what's called cognitive restraint. And cognitive restraint refers to an intention to eat less overall and or to eat less of foods viewed as unhealthy. So in some ways you can think of it as sort of a dieting mindset. And so what I have done is I put together a number of different studies that looked at a stressor in the laboratory and then included two groups, one that was high on cognitive restraint and one that was low. And what you're seeing here are the results of what's called a meta-analysis. And that's just a fancy term that means putting together the results of different studies, because that gives you more participants. You know, individual studies tend to be small, and it can give you a clearer picture of what's going on overall. And each of these little squares represents the estimate for an individual study, and the big diamond below represents the summary across all the studies. Over here, so on the right direction means people ate more in the laboratory after the stressor. The left direction is less. And what you see is for the higher cognitive restraint group, on average, people tend to eat more after the stressor. And that's not true in the lower cognitive restraint group. If anything, the direction is towards less. And there's also a significant difference between these two groups. So in other words, the higher cognitive restraint group eats significantly more after a stressor than the lower cognitive restraint group. And so next, I'm going to talk about a study that's a bit of a non sequitur, but I just enjoy it so much, I wanted to include it. And so we've been talking about does stress impact food intake? But this study really goes in the other direction, and it looks at does food intake impact stress? And in this study, which included young women who did not have eating disorders, what they did was they experienced a stressor, and while they were anticipating the stressor, some women were given a comfort food, so a food that they deemed a comfort food, and some women weren't. And then after the stressor, some other women were given a comfort food that they deemed comforting, and some other women weren't. And throughout, the investigators were asking people about their subjective experience of stress and also collecting biological measures like cortisol. And what you would think is that, well, probably the comfort food reduced people's stress. But at least in this study, eating the comfort food did not, on average, reduce people's subjectively experienced stress or the biological measures of stress, either when they consumed it while anticipating the stressor or immediately after the stressor. And that's one thing that's important to note is it may have reduced people's stress in the moments they were eating the food, but stress was not measured while they were actually eating. But it does tell us that sort of afterwards, after eating, on average, eating these comfort foods does not seem to reduce people's stress levels, either psychologically or biologically. So at this point, I'm going to try and tie things together for you. And I'm going to focus on some takeaway messages. And so first, we're going to talk about, essentially, in these laboratory studies, they're looking at food intake immediately after a single acute stressor. And what they tell us is that, as we suspected and knew from self-report, some people do, or suspected based on self-report, some people do seem to eat more after an acute stressor. But it's not necessarily the people who report eating more when they're stressed in general. But it is more likely to be people who report higher cognitive restraint. And then a similar, if not slightly smaller, number of people do seem to eat less when they're stressed. And they're not necessarily the people who report eating less when they're stressed, but they are slightly more likely to be people who report lower cognitive restraint. So who aren't trying to control, trying to eat less or eat fewer foods they deem unhealthy. And so what does self-report of stress-related eating not seem to measure? So it doesn't seem to measure how single acute stressors affect people's food intake immediately after the stressor. And that would be this scenario. So this is how someone's stress level is fluctuating over time. And in the laboratory studies, we tend to be looking at a stressor, an single acute stressor, the eating immediately afterwards, compared to something that's not stressful and the eating immediately afterwards. So it does not seem that the self-report measures of stress eating are capturing the differences in eating right after a stressor. Well, if it doesn't seem like they're capturing that, then what are they actually capturing? So one possibility is that these measures, the self-report measures of stress-related eating, are capturing different aspects of stress-related eating. So maybe they're actually capturing a more delayed response to acute stressors. So, this scenario where you have a stressor in the morning at work, but then you eat more that evening once you're home. So that's one possibility, that maybe these self-report measures are picking up that phenomenon. Another possibility is they're picking up people's response to a pileup of acute stressors. So in other words, maybe one stressor doesn't really have a huge impact on people's food intake, but maybe it's the pileup of multiple stressors that does. And that would be this scenario here, where you have multiple stressors in a row, and then you're looking at people's subsequent eating behavior. And lastly, it's possible that maybe what these questionnaires are reflecting is on a much broader time scale. Maybe it's looking at how people's eating changes in times of generally high or prolonged stress. So like 2024 for this person, compared to times when their stress is generally lower. And so that's one school of thought, which is that maybe these questionnaires are reflecting different aspects of the ground truth that isn't captured necessarily in the laboratory or the cell phone methods. But other people have said, well, maybe these measures are actually reflecting something else that isn't actually people's actual stress-related eating. This is not an exhaustive list, but some people have said, well, maybe these measures are just a reflection of greater concern about one's eating. Maybe self-report of emotional or stress-related eating reflects a tendency to incorrectly attribute past overeating to negative emotions or stress. Or maybe they reflect a tendency to overestimate your eating when you're stressed. And so I'm going to end by circling back to the very beginning. And I'm going to go back to that first question I posed at the beginning of the talk and say, is stress really desserts spelled backwards? For some people, yes. But for other people, what I actually like to say is that stress rhymes with less, and they tend to eat less when they're experiencing stress, at least immediately afterwards. And so I'm going to end there. And thank you very much for listening to my presentation. And I want to make sure that people have time to ask questions.
Well, Kristin, first of all, thank you for an excellent presentation and really explaining how this work is done in a very user-friendly way for non-scientists. So thank you so much for
Oh,
that.
my pleasure.
And as you had said, um, a lot of this work is in people who do not have an eating disorder. I wonder if you could give us a little bit of information about this issue for people who may have an eating disorder.
Yeah, so that is a great question. And so I will say there are not as many studies that focus on eating disorders, especially for anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. There are more on binge eating disorder. And what I would say is that, probably for the few studies that focus on bulimia nervosa, it seems that on average, eating might increase with stress. Sort of opposite for anorexia nervosa, it might decrease with stress on average. And for binge eating disorder, it again might increase on average. But what I will say is there's a lot of variability in these studies, which tells us that there's really, there may be sort of an average direction, but there's a lot of differences between people and which way people's eating changes overall. And a lot of the studies on eating disorders have looked, especially, or not necessarily at food intake, more at like cravings or desire to eat. So there's a smaller number of studies that actually look at total food intake.
And let me ask you, there's obviously a lot of information in the press. We hear about the GLP-1 medications. Is there any work being done looking at the issue of stress and eating and the GLP-1s?
So I've heard some of my colleagues who prescribe GLP-1s sort of comment, anecdotally on what they've observed. To my knowledge, there is nothing particularly, that's particularly definitive that talks about how GLP-1s impact stress eating. And I think in some ways it would be hard to know, because one implication of what I just talked about is we're not entirely sure that people's self-report of stress eating reflects their actual stress eating. And so if you're looking at the effect of an intervention, whether a medication or mindfulness, GLP-1, and then you're just looking at people's report of how their stress eating changes, and you see a change, it's hard to know, did their perception of their stress eating change, or did their actual stress eating change? So that is, one implication of what I talked about, is it's then hard to know what interventions are actually affecting. Is it people's perception, or is it actual changes in their intake when they're stressed?
Interesting point. And let me, while we're talking about sort of people's perception, how can a person determine whether they are, eat more or less when they're stressed? Is there a good way for somebody to figure that out? And part two of that question is there a best approach to, is more, less, or maybe trying to aim for usual? What's the best answer to that question?
Right. So, that's a great question as well. And, I think, one approach that's been used for many years in cognitive behavioral therapy for eating disorders is keeping a diary. And you would record, stressors or times when your stress is high, as well as, what you eat. And then in cognitive behavioral therapy, you would look through that with your therapist. If you were doing this on your own, you would look at it on your own and see if you can detect any patterns. Like, do you really seem to be eating more when you're stressed? Of course, that there's still the problem that if your perception of how much you're eating changes when you're stressed, that could sort of color your view of what's happening. But in general, people's report of what they're eating is a little bit more accurate than how much. And also for people who are tech savvy, there are apps out there that are what are called symptom trackers. And they allow you to sort of identify factors that might relate to certain symptoms. And so if you're tech savvy, you could set it up so that one of the factors you're tracking is your stress level. And then the symptom would be, your eating, or some aspect of your eating. And then basically the app would sort of tell you, like, does your stress seem to be related to your eating? That does require a fairly, considerable degree of being tech savvy, because you'd have to be able to set up the app to do that. And then one of the things I've been working on is, we know self-report is not going to be perfect, but can we at least improve it somewhat? And I alluded to that when I showed that slide earlier, comparing the two approaches to assessing your stress eating, that maybe there are ways that, although not perfect, are better than the current approaches. And so I've been working on one study that's sort of looking at, if we ask the questions a slightly different way, do people's responses seem to at least somewhat map onto what we find in the laboratory? So I do think it is possible to ask questions in a, at least a somewhat better way that more accurately captures what happens for people.
Well, Kristin, I want to thank you again for joining us today, for the ongoing work that you've been doing. Thank you so very, very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Yes. Also, I want to thank those in the audience who joined us today. And I'd like to ask people to consider making a donation to BBRF. 100% of every dollar donated for research is invested in our research grants. We're able to do this because our operating expenses are covered by separate foundation grants. This means that when you donate $1 for research, that dollar goes directly to the research. To make a gift, please visit our website, bbrfoundation.org, or call 1-800-829-8289. This webinar has been recorded. If you've missed any portion of it or would like to share it with friends or family, please do so. And please join us again on June 10th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, when Dr. Emma Johnson, Assistant Professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis, will present Does Cannabis Use During Pregnancy Affect Gene Regulation in Placental Tissues? Thank you, and remember, together we can dramatically improve the lives of those living with mental illness and enable more people to live full, happy, and productive lives. Take care.